So my presentation is actually written down, so I will try to keep time. I'd like to initially give an explanation for the title of my presentation. Women on the Move is a phrase or a slogan that emerged from the 1995 Beijing World Conference for Women. The same year, an exhibition of this title was held at the Nomo Gallery in Kampala, Uganda. Organized by Lilian Nabulime, the show included the following artists: Sylvie Katende, Lilian Nabulime, Margaret Nagawa, Rose Chirumira, and Maria Naita. When I did some more digging, as I only happened to find this title by chance in a newspaper archive, there was an explicit connection between the two events. One of the artists in the show had attended the conference. The show tried to connect ideas presented in the Beijing conference to the local art scene. A catalog was published on the occasion of the show, though very little remains of it. Perhaps what remains is the memory of the show's connection to a larger wave of women's emancipation and women's organizing, particular to the 1990s. Margaret Nagawa told me the mood of the show is not only about the Beijing conference, but it is wider in Uganda. During the 1995 conference, several concerns emerged: women's health care and its research, HIV/AIDS awareness, education of the girl child, and a specific concern about violence against women. As the Beijing Declaration and Plan for Action noted, violence against women is an obstacle to the achievement of the objectives of equality, development, and peace. Violence against women both violates and impairs or nullifies the enjoyment by women of their human rights and fundamental freedoms. Knowledge about its causes and consequences, as well as its incidents and measures to combat it, have greatly expanded since the Nairobi conference. This latter conference was echoed. In Hillary Clinton's speech during the 1995 conference, when she asked, "Wasn't it after all, after the Women's Conference in Nairobi 10 years ago, that the world focused for the first time on the crisis of domestic violence?" To contextualize these statements, it's crucial to consider the social history between 1985 and 1995 in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa. A larger political framework during the early 90s is one of shifts in world economies, with the introduction of structural adjustment programs and intensely neoliberal economics spread through Uganda, Kenya, Ghana, and other countries in Africa. Is one of significant political shift in South Africa from apartheid to a democratically led government with Nelson Mandela as president. Yeah, that was a quote from the Plan for Action. And this is the 1985 conference images. In South Africa, the ANC Women's League, sorry, I'm getting to that. This is made for the 1985 conference, sort of, that happened in Kenya, Nairobi, before. And this is still that as well. In South Africa, the ANC Women's League, which we can see here, was unbanned in 1990, signaling the resurgence of African women's organizing in the country, and this led to the establishment of the World's National Coalition in 1992. In Uganda, a considerable shift in education occurred with the introduction of the government white paper on education in 1991. The paper recommended positive discrimination for girls in the university entry system. In 1992, a group of women protested against the detainment of political prisoners, members of an opposition party in Nairobi, Kenya. This event is sometimes referred to as a mother's protest. The event was extremely successful in leading up to the release of more than 50 political prisoners under the regime of Kenya's President Daniel Arap Moi in 1992. In neighboring Uganda, the aftermath of the Bush War, 1981 to 1985, as artist and scholar Margaret Nagawa told me in an interview, weighed heavily as shown in a lack of self-confidence among artists in Uganda. Many had gone into exile by the mid-1980s, and those who stayed did very little in the way of producing exhibitions. It was in this uneventful period that the Gallery Cafe opened in 1993, going on to be a leading commercial gallery. Nagawa stresses the way in which foreigners intervened in Kampala's art scene. Rosemary Rishna, a German artist who collaborated often with the Makerere Gallery, produced a major exhibition, Peace and War, on the 1980s Bush War and its aftermath. The show was installed at the first Johannesburg Biennial in 1995. This is some of the, I think, subject matter, images from the 80s. A male-dominated show, Lilian Nabulime, artist and curator of Women on the Move, later that year was the only woman artist out of a dozen. The work that Nabulime contributed to the exhibition Flight, 1995, was devoted to and inspired by South Africa's political transition from apartheid to a democratic government, while the work strongly echoed the rebirth of Uganda and the dawn of a new political climate. The artist's interest in working with found wood and tree roots reflects her affinity for organic forms. When looking at the 30-year period covered in this presentation, I was interested in the ideas of two scholars, Sierra Leonean anthropologist Philomena Chioma-Stedi and Ugandan lawyer Sylvia Tamale. These scholars represent both periods before and after 2006. Wait, that's Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela, probably in the early 90s. And this is Sylvia Tamale. I have to note that no exhibition or art historical survey focusing on African women artists attempts to cover this 30-year period. Neither am I trying to substitute art history for something else. In contrast, I acknowledge the importance of these academic works to understanding of the social history of women's politics and organizing in Africa. Both Tamale and Chioma-Stedi have produced monographic books on subjects broadly related to African women and feminism. Chioma-Stedi's 1981, The Black Woman Cross-Culturally, and Sylvia Tamale's 2001 book, you can see here, African Sexualities, A Reader. The shifts that occur between 1985 and 1995 reflect Chioma-Stedi's writings on women in politics and economic development. Much evidence exists of women in politics and women in private sectors in East Africa in the 1990s and 2000s. These seemingly new paradigms in politics are partially the result of success of the African women's movement. This, however, is not the case in contemporary art, and one has to wonder why this is so. While there are more women artists participating in the art field than before, the appearance of a group or solo exhibition of women artists in the 1990s was quite exceptional. This is the case with Women on the Move in 1995 at the Normal Gallery, and Artistically Speaking Women, 1997, at the Gallery Cafe, both in Uganda. One of the things that differentiates Chioma-Stedi and Tamale is the subject of sexuality. Tamale, who compiled a volume, African Sexualities, is invested in the question of women's liberation through the prism of the law and women's bodies. Tamale's work on the legal frameworks on sexualities is the result of her focused engagement with the 1990s and 2000s legislation in Uganda. This topic similarly relates in more recent years to queer sexualities. African feminism for Tamale attempts to view a cross-section of sexualities, blurring differences where possible, and bridging gaps in some areas. Uganda's complex legal system, a combination of constitutional, customary, religious laws, often discards the interest in women's rights when focused on areas of public and private ownership, such as land and especially sexuality. According to Tamale, the common denominator that links all morality offenses in Uganda's law is sexuality, particularly women's sexuality. Not only indicating an excessive colonial hangover, but an aggressive reinforcement of colonial governmentality. The woman's body is viewed within this dialectic as a kind of territory to be purchased, dominated, or conquered, and this is reflected in the excessive use of force by police, as well as the peculiarity of customary, religious, and constitutional laws of Uganda. Chioma's study takes much more of an anthropological approach. This is the 1975 conference in Mexico. Her Chioma Studies' 1981 book, The Black Woman Cross-Culturally, is an overview and anthropological study of the challenges of Black women in the African continent and within the diaspora. I view it as a natural precedent for the 1987 edited volume, Women in Africa. This is Chioma's study, The Black Woman Cross-Culturally. I view it as a natural precedent for the 1987 edited volume, Women in Africa and the Diaspora, the African Diaspora, in which Chioma's study contributes an essay. With an anthropological approach, the African woman is imagined in a traditional context of African societies. Chioma's study is interested in the idea of a traditional African family and contributes to conversations on women in the sphere of development. Chioma's study wrote a 1975 thesis on women in politics in Sierra Leone, titled Female Power in Politics, the National Congress of Sierra Leone, making an anthropology of the political sphere by studying the National Congress in Sierra Leone. In the section titled Autonomy and Female Power in this thesis, Chioma's study writes, although the All People's Congress aims its appeal at every Sierra Leonean, irrespective of sex, its constitution clearly highlights the inclusion of women in the party machinery. Chioma's study is invested in women's political participation in decision-making, government and political parties, as her review of the 1985 Nairobi Conference shows. However, progress in the participation of women in decision-making in government, trade unions, and political parties remains slow. In almost all countries, women have the right to vote on paper, to be eligible for election or appointment to public office, and to exercise public functions on equal terms with men at the local, national, and international levels. In most countries, however, women participate only marginally at the highest levels of decision-making. Arguing for more Black women in political participation became very foundational for the women's movements regionally in Africa and in these larger conferences, such as the Nairobi World Conference for Women in 1985, which I showed pictures of earlier, but this was the 1975 conference, but I could probably find more. There's a relationship between the two scholars when, in 1999, Tamale publishes a thesis on women in parliamentary politics in Uganda. When hens begin to crow, gender and parliamentary politics in Uganda. Tamale is not an anthropologist by training, but rather a lawyer, and the Constitution and lawmaking is her primary concern. Chioma's study discusses the survival of women in the absence of men. Female-headed households developed as a survival mechanisms among Black women not only in Africa, but also in their diaspora, as this form of social organization was adapted to precarious and subsistent economic and military situations. Both of these writers are quite stern on the question of ownership. Tamale is intensely aware of the disenfranchisement within the legal system relating to women's land ownership. She writes in her paper about the Amuru women who protest a massive land grab in northern Uganda. In April 2015, women in Amuru district in northern Uganda stripped naked in protest against what they perceived as the grabbing of their ancestral land by government, and so on and so forth. For Chioma's study, for the most part, I should probably read this actually. The Minister of Lands and that of Internal Affairs had traveled to Amuru to try and mediate the situation, only to be confronted by naked protesting women shouting profanities and asking pointed questions. We were born on this land. Where will we, the elderly mothers, go? Why is government targeting our land? Why? The ministers ordered the immediate withdrawal of the army and the police that had been camping on the disputed land for 2 weeks. They also instructed the government officials at the site to abandon their plans to demarcate the land. For Chioma's study, for the most part, communal ownership facilitated women's access to land and ensured a certain degree of control over their labor, as well as some decision-making about their labor input. Chioma's study is critical of neocolonialism and its role in underdeveloping African countries. The incorporation of Africa into the world economic system has made the continent a battlefield in an ongoing struggle among world powers for economic, cultural, and ideological domination. The struggle has produced some of the most devastating effects on the African family. The processes of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism, and apartheid have resulted in chronic underdevelopment. So when thinking of the larger success of the women's movement, Women on the Move has signaled women's upward participation in politics and higher education, argued for in the 1985 conference. The 1995 conference resolution to diminish violence against women is yet to be realized, in Uganda at least. The larger context of the period from 1995 to 2015 includes several crucial events that reflect violence against women. These events are larger in scope than the previous stated developmental goals of Chioma Studies writing. Referencing Wairimu Murithi in Concerning Nuditude, feminism is either about land or decolonization. These are mutually constituted through violence and domination carried out in the law and police brutality. In 2006, the image you see here, women protested against sexual violence in the university during the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in South Africa. In this case, a campaign to decolonize, the university met rather uncomfortably with a campaign against sexual violence. Imperialism often envisioned the colony as a body, particularly the woman's body, as a territory to be possessed, fought for, conquered, and exploited. Think about, this is an image from that same protest. Rhodes Must Fall. The work of Zanele Moholi in exhibitions Being, 2007, Only Half the Picture, 2006, at the Stevenson Gallery in South Africa, exposes the way in which transnational feminism has been limited in its engagement with sexuality and the violence incurred by queer and non-gender conforming persons. The work also reveals a side to the master-slave dynamic that feminism of the kind in Chioma's study was yet to engage, but which is evident in Tamale's book on African sexualities. In the post-2005 period, questions about the use of excessive violence on protesters abound. In Uganda, protesters against the detainment and groping of women, of a woman opposition politician, Ingrid Turinawe, who we see in this picture, stormed Kampala streets in their bras. While Ingrid Turinawe is one of many women politicians in Uganda's parliament, a fact which shows a move towards equality in political participation for women, physical violence has been a tool of domination and shaming women into submission. In 2010, after President Museveni failed to sign the domestic violence bill into law, The Guardian reported Alice Alaso, the Secretary General of the Forum for Democratic Change, the main opposition party in Uganda, said the president had yet to give the bill assent, despite it being passed by Parliament. It was given the green light by the cabinet more than a year ago. The report adds a word on threatening women political aspirants with violence. Cases of domestic violence have hindered women's emancipation in Katine, said Christine Aguero, a women's representative on the Katine Sub-County Council. Often women do not attend meetings or take up leadership positions because they are threatened by their husbands, she said. In 2009, the anti-homosexuality bill was tabled in the Uganda parliament by largely religious conservatives. In 2011, David Kato, who we're seeing here, a leading activist, was murdered, and for his persistent opposition to the bill. The event produced a wave of international condemnation and ultimately a crisis in parliament. After 5 years, the bill was passed, but then was struck down immediately. In 2014, the artist Babidi Leila showed work at the Kampala Biennial based on her psychological experiences during the anti-homosexuality bill debate. As a daughter, she felt rejected by her family. She used to polythene wood, nails, paper, and the burning of these materials to illustrate psychological pain and emotional anxieties. This process mirrored her own family's ambivalence and, by extension, society's rejection of her gay identity. I will attempt to give some context to this and how it relates to an earlier time period. Babidia was a student at the Makerere Art School in 2011, where she studied with Lillian Nabulime, the artist of Women on the Move. They instantly connected and shared a mutual interest in sculpture as teacher and student. Though in the aftermath of David Kato's passing, Babidia became more open and vocal about her sexuality, and as a result, risked losing her friendship with Nabulime. How, one might ask, does one generation of women relate to the other? Student to their teacher, in the presence of stark differences, particularly those of sexuality. Even though Nabulime belongs to the group of the 1990s Women on the Move artists, there remains a tension in the drift in her relation to sexuality. The purpose of my mentioning her views is to point out how values have shifted from the 1990s to the post-2006 period within the sphere of women's activism. This is a work she showed at the Kampala Biennial. The older group of African feminists aligns itself with religious and family-oriented values shown in the writings of Chioma Steady, while a younger group aligns itself with conversation around the body and the opposition to sexual violence. The issue of intimacy between women, as visualized in South Africa, South African photographer Zanele Moholi, remains at the crux of a split between the 1990s wave of African feminism and a more recent post-2006 wave. This is one of Zanele's works. When considering the larger context of the 1990s and 2000s in Uganda, Kenya, and South Africa, one easily identifies the fact that women, though emancipated through education and in politics, were not celebrated within the art field, which remained limiting to women's contributions. Earlier waves of African feminism contrast with more recent ones, predominantly through sexuality and the body politic, as noted in the writing of Tamale. This latter debate shows the use of excessive violence in the post-colonial period and the act of recolonizing, largely via the domination of women's and gay men's bodies through the various acts of violence. The work of Zanele Moholi and Babidi Leila, among others, reveals the position of artists as transgressor through bringing the post-2006 feminist politics directly into the art field. So this is work from 2006 and 2007. Zanele Moholi. This is from 2006, a show she did at a Stevenson gallery. Yeah, that's another work. Thank you very much.